So Attorney General Merrick Garland is suing Texas over its draconian anti-abortion law. What chance does that lawsuit stand? Well, let's talk about it in today's video. Hi, I'm Mike Greiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. If you share my concerns, maybe you could like this video and subscribe to this channel, maybe even click that little bell that will notify you when I post something new. So we don't need to revisit what Texas has done with their abortion law, and in fact, I've already done at least one video on this subject matter, which I'll link to up above. But Attorney General Merrick Garland comes to the rescue, saying that he's going to sue Texas over the law. After all, says Merrick Garland, the law is in clear violation of Supreme Court precedent, and so needs to be struck down. What do I think of Merrick Garland's chances in this lawsuit? Well, unfortunately, I don't think they're very good. Now, you should know, I am a lawyer, and I have personally experienced the situation when you have different judges rule different ways just based upon their different perspectives. And you know that if your case had gone to the other judge, they would have ruled differently. In fact, I joked with my wife that I always seem to have bad luck as to which judge got chosen. Well, that is certainly true with the Supreme Court right now. And we saw an example of that in the Brnovich versus Democratic National Committee decision that was released not too long ago. That case, which probably put the final nail in the coffin of the Voting Rights Act, had a 6-3 decision written by Justice Samuel Alito. Now, you have to understand, that decision is not based upon constitutional concerns. That decision is based upon interpreting the law that Congress passed, the Voting Rights Act. Now, if you wonder what the Voting Rights Act says, you can just simply look it up because it's written down. And I can tell you that when I was practicing law, it was not uncommon for us lawyers and the judge to pull out copies of the statute to review specifically what it says and then argue how the specific words in the statute apply to our situation. But Alito, in the Brnovich decision, and I did do a separate video on that decision up here, Alito basically made up stuff that's not in the statute. For example, he said that states can impose restrictions on voting that are inconvenient, as long as it serves the purpose of stopping fraud. Well, that language is nowhere in the statute. And even more unbelievable is his assertion that the states can do anything they want as long as they don't exceed the voting restrictions that were in effect in 1982, 40 years ago. That was, by the way, the last time that an amendment was made to the Voting Rights Act. But the statute says nothing about that. And in fact, you have to remember the statute was passed to address abuses that there were of voting rights across the country. So if we're saying the states can do anything that they were doing back in 1982, that's basically voiding the whole purpose of the Voting Rights Act, which was to address these abuses that existed in 1982. But that language is nowhere in the statute. Nowhere does it mention 1982. Nowhere does it mention restrictions that were currently in effect. This is something that was purely made up by Justice Alito. Elena Kagan, who's become my new hero on the Supreme Court, has been very aggressive on criticizing the majority about how they've basically been making law as it suits them. As Elena Kagan wrote in her dissent, she said the majority is yet again rewriting the Voting Rights Act. And that's exactly what's happening. They literally have taken a law that was passed by the elected representatives of this country in Congress, and they're changing it to suit their own ideological views. The Supreme Court has no accountability. As it's currently set up, they have lifetime appointments. There's no way to review what they did, and what they say is just the law. So literally, they have taken the place of our elected representatives in making law. That's not what courts are supposed to do. They're supposed to interpret law, not make law. In other words, the conservative majority has shown themselves that they're no longer willing to be bound by the requirements of what the law says. They're just going to make things up as they see fit. Why is this relevant to the Texas case? Well, Merrick Garland is absolutely right that current Supreme Court precedent demands that the Texas abortion law be struck down. But yet the Supreme Court has made it clear they don't care about precedent. They don't care about what the law says. They're just going to say whatever they want based upon their ideology. In fact, they already signaled their position on this law when in their shadow docket, they issued an opinion without any kind of oral arguments that allowed the law to go into effect despite its clear unconstitutionality under current law. And again, I do post to another video on that up here. So where does that leave Merrick Garland's lawsuit? Well, the reality is, if it's going to get anywhere, it's going to be ultimately decided in the Supreme Court. Even if it doesn't make it to the Supreme Court, what the Supreme Court can do is simply decide not to hear the case if it likes the decision that the lower courts have issued. And of course, we know that many of the judges in lower courts at this point have already been appointed by Trump. And many of them have shown their clear deference for the ideology over what the law says. So even if the Supreme Court doesn't hear it, they can still leave their imprimatur on this law. But if they do hear it, they make it clear that they do not see any kind of constitutional right to an abortion, or to privacy for that matter. And that was signaled very clearly in the 400-word decision that was issued in their shadow docket case on this Texas statute. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that this lawsuit is likely dead on arrival. So why is Merrick Garland filing this lawsuit? Well, I think that he's under a lot of pressure from progressives and liberals within the Democratic Party who are very concerned about what's going on in Texas and very fearful about an expansion of this approach throughout the country. There is a sentiment that the administration had to do something to address this, and so Merrick Garland's going to file a lawsuit. That's going to make it appear that the administration is doing something, even though I'm sure Merrick Garland knows the odds of success are minimal. This is very similar to the way that President Biden has been dealing with the ideological bent of the court by setting up essentially a blue ribbon panel to review what could be done. Now, when he gets asked about the situation on the Supreme Court, he just says, hey, we're waiting for the committee report. It handles a political problem for him. We as liberals and progressives cannot give up the pressure that we've been putting on the administration and on Democrats in Congress to address this. And there are several things they can do to address this problem in the long run. The first thing that Congress can do is they can pass voting rights legislation that will protect the right to vote across the country and stop Republicans from trying to make sure they stay in office even though they no longer represent the majority of Americans. The second thing Congress can do is to essentially pass legislation that will in some way reform the court to make it so that it cannot become the political football anymore that it has been. Reforms can be mild, including things like term limits on the justices, which is allowed under the Constitution, to more extreme ideas like expanding the size of the court, which would then allow President Biden to appoint a number of justices to counter this ideological majority who have taken control of the court. What's standing in the way of this happening? Well, the filibuster, of course, because Republicans stand rock solid against any of these things happening because, of course, they know that it would diminish their power. They have worked hard to take over the Supreme Court because they know that the Supreme Court will write laws, essentially, when Congress won't, and then all they have to do in Congress is stand in the way of anything happen and let the Supreme Court do its job of allowing the conservatives to take over this country. The unwillingness of a couple of Democratic senators, like Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin in particular, to get rid of the filibuster to address these crises is really disturbing. And we need to put pressure on all Democrats to continue to press this issue. But what's more is in the next election, the 2022 election, we need to make sure that the Democrats not only take Congress, but that they take the Senate with a larger majority, giving us a little bit of breathing room so we don't allow senators like Sinema and Manchin to stand in the way of us getting things done. That could happen, by the way. There are a couple of states, including Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, for example, that were won by President Biden, that have strong Democratic candidates, and where the Republican is either retiring or thinking about retiring, or is in serious danger of being defeated. And among the Democrats, really the only state I think that we're in serious danger of losing would be New Hampshire. And there, in a special election, the Democrats just won a seat that traditionally had been in Republican hands. So I think it shows that the Democratic Party is still strong in New Hampshire, and there's a good possibility that Maggie Hassan will still be reelected. If that happens, that could give the Democrats a 2-3 vote majority in the Senate, which would then give us the breathing room to potentially get rid of the filibuster and pass some of this desperately needed legislation. But to do that, remember, we need to hold on to the House. And the Republicans are doing everything they can to gerrymander it to make sure that we don't hold on to it. In fact, Governor Abbott of Texas, once again, is calling another special session of the legislature, this time with its sole goal of gerrymandering the state congressional delegation, because he realizes how much is at stake in 2022. The Republicans realize how much is at stake. We as Democrats cannot forget that. Well, if you agree with me or disagree with me, I'd love to hear your comments down below. And if you could like this video and subscribe to this channel, that'd be a huge help. I'll see you in the next video. In the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.